If you want to be more effective in your work and in your life, and you'd like to have more confidence that you're meeting your intentions, this is where it begins. Welcome to Do Busy Right, helping you organize your information and manage your attention so that they work for you, not against you. We educate you and encourage you by discussing ways to be more effective, not more exhausted. Let's do busy right. Hi there. Today, I want to talk a little bit about an interaction that I had in a sales meeting around attention compass, and just to talk about the way a potential client understood what I was saying because he hadn't heard this before. Maybe you haven't heard it as well. And so it encouraged. Paul, his name, and I were talking about several ideas around managing tasks and attention. And I happened to mention the background of the term multitask. And when I told him that, his reaction was intense interest and curiosity. And he started asking questions. Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that. What does that mean? And I realized that he wasn't familiar with that story. So I told it to him, the whole story. And from there, it became clear to him that there's one less reason to think that humans can multitask. And it's funny because it's almost like we all believe the same fable. And the fact that he learned from the story encouraged him to realize that he really needed to take care of that multitasking and start taking his attention management a good bit more seriously. Before we get started on the story, I'll say I have this hypothesis. In general, if we're misinformed about our capabilities, then we engage in sort of a negative cycle. And when I say this, I mean capabilities of humans in general. I don't mean capabilities of a single person who's trying to learn to do something that other people have demonstrated. I'm not talking about trying to learn a skill. I'm talking about trying to do something that we haven't demonstrated the capacity that we can do as humans. And I think the first thing we do is we sort of engage in denial. We really try to claim that we have this ability, and we try to really hard to do the thing that we can't do, and we fail to do it, and then we feel bad about not doing it. And that leads to us, for some reason, doing nothing to work around it. And I think it's just discouragement. And I don't know if this is a general thing, but it certainly works this way when we talk about, things like managing our attention, and people just get discouraged. So we don't want to think about it. And we don't want to think about the fact that we need help or that we might lack a skill. And of course, in this case, we're talking about multitasking. The fact is we can do only one useful thing at a time. And therefore, we have to postpone the other nearly infinite number of things that we want to or could be doing. And we need systems to help us postpone those things well. Otherwise, we fall back into distraction, and that leads to more multitasking. But we continue to hear people imply that humans can multitask. So somewhere we believe this. So instead of investing in systems and knowledge to help us where we fall short as humans, we feel bad about our apparent inability. And then we seemingly try to hide it or bluff it or, explain it away, even from ourselves, and we don't do anything. And it's like we don't want to acknowledge our weaknesses, so we don't use a tool that helps us. Fair enough. I understand. I'm a human. I have human nature, so I understand human nature. Nobody wants to walk around with a crutch. Nobody wants to feel like they're fallen short in some way that's obvious to everybody else. We all want to be masters of our universe, and we all want to be good at things. But we do need a little dose of humility, I think. And if we don't have that, then our understanding that we should be able to do this thing, multitasking, is based on the assumption that everybody else is right and we're wrong, and that they're doing it rather than they're just somehow managing to fool themselves. Because if they're wrong, then what we're doing is counterproductive and it's not helping us. If we cannot in fact multitask, then the way we go about doing our things is counterproductive and is not helping us. So I wanted to talk a little bit through the story. I have a background in computing, and having that background, it occurred to me that we've been struggling to make multitasking computers now for 60 or 70 years, and we haven't been able to do it. And so I went back and I looked at Google's Ngram search, which is a fancy name for a word search across all the text that they're aware of. And I found that the use of the term multitasking didn't start until 1965 or so. And I realized pretty quickly what was going on because of my background in computing, and we're still struggling with this sort of thing. And then later on, I read a confirming article from WGBH that was talking about whether or not we can multitask. And several people in that article commented on, no, we can't. And nobody knows where we got the idea. And they discussed that in this article, and they came to the same conclusion that I did, is we got the idea from the discussion of computing. And so the story, when we developed computers, we were building machines. And I think this is a fascinating story about the capacity of human imagination. And maybe, I'm quite sure I've told this before. But what happened is we found that we could have a multi-purpose machine. And we don't think too much about that now, but that's a pretty radical concept if you roll back to, say, 1950. Because physical machines are pretty much single purpose, particularly if they've got motors and things. A saw is a saw, and it's very difficult to turn a saw into a drill. But with the rise of computers, we discovered that a machine built in these ways could do multiple different kinds of computing tasks. And by that, we recognized that it could become a multi-purpose machine. And when I say multi-purpose, I mean that the same computer could do word processing and spreadsheets. And that, again, when you think of it, that's a really insightful concept for somebody to have. But over time, because of the constraints and the expense of computing, we tried to make it faster and faster and faster. We tried to make the computer faster and faster and faster. And one really interesting insight that somebody had and decided to try came from the fact that early on, computers wandered off and did their task, and it took some time, and then the computer would come back and give us the result of the task. And so the notion was you give the computer some instructions, and then you go off and have a cup of coffee and come back and you'd have the answer there. Well, the engineering types felt like that was a waste of resource and a waste of time, and human beings sitting around twiddling their thumbs. So is there some way we can more effectively move things along? Also, computers are pretty expensive devices, and if you have to have one computer for word processing and another computer for spreadsheets, then pretty soon that's going to get all out of whack in our budget. And so we developed all this, and we developed this multi-purpose computer. And then we wanted it to be faster, or at least appear to be faster. So we sped up the components. And then we still wanted it to be faster or appear to be faster. And so we developed a way for it to switch tasks. So the fact that it's a multi-purpose computer means that it can do more than one task. But the task switching was not trivial. And so what happened, one of the things that the computer engineers in the world out there learned to do was how to make a machine that could switch tasks very quickly. So they were multi-purpose, but they were single task. And they're largely still single task. But this is in the 60s and the mid 60s, and that's where all this discussion started. And engineers were talking about multitasking and computers and emulating multitasking and what do we do? How do we time slice so that we can get the most computing computations out of a machine and all this different sort of stuff. And engineers, right? I've never met an engineer who thought what they had built was too fast or too small. And they're constantly trying to make these improvements. And so they just got this burr under their saddle about, can we make it do this thing? And well, they did it. Now, multitasking was the term that they used, and it's still used some in computing, even though the definition is not perfectly clear what we mean by multitasking. And there's one of two primary, I think, definitions that may be in play depending on what we're talking about. And one definition is the definition of multitasking that we think of as humans, which is literally doing two things at the same time or more. If we take that definition and apply it, then computers can't do it. Now, if we take the different definition of multitasking, which is it appears that things are going on, it appears to the human that things are going on all at once, then that's different than the multitasking we expect humans to do, or that we're trying to question whether humans can do. And if we try to apply that definition to computers, it works. And so computers can time slice very quickly. And so to human perception, it seems like multiple things are going on at once, but they're really not. And the computers have been engineered and honed to do this, and the smartest people who have ever lived have worked on these things for a long, long time, and they finally got down to the fact where computers do actually appear to be doing multiple things at the same time. To give you an example, while I'm recording the podcast, there's the recording going on, and of course, a Zoom meeting, and I've got a Word document up for my notes, and I've got a clock running, so I know how long it's taken to do this recording. And all these things appear to be going on at the same time for me, but they're really not. They're time slicing, and different things are happening in different little tiny slices of time. They work in very small chunks, but the switching is imperceptible to me. But this mechanism, I don't think was ever intended to apply to human people, because we know we can't task switch quickly and effectively. So if this is a term that can't be applied to people, well, how did it get applied to human people? And why did we adopt it to start talking about something that humans really can't do? And I'll say, really, there's probably two things that kind of drove us in this direction. One is we think about a computer as a brain and a brain as a computer. There was a time when we thought a lot about this idea. And I don't know where it is in the popular imagination. It's only at a very, very abstract level that a computer and a human brain do similar things. And it's really not true that computers work like our brains work or vice versa. But that was an idea that had gotten popularized at the time, a metaphor, if you will, for people to understand computers. And that idea kind of got out, and we were at the time, the culture was talking about cybernetics and robotics and all these different sorts of things. But this word just kind of leaked out and said, okay, if a computer is like a human brain and we're trying to get computers to multitask, then maybe a human brain can multitask as well. As near as I can tell, that's the first reason why this kind of got out into the world. The other thing is we have these glimmers that we could do it. And we're humans, so certain things we do, I'm going to say autonomously. And other things that we do that are so habitual for us that they've receded into the background of our consciousness. Things like walking. Talking is often a fairly autonomous process. And it appears that we can do multiple things at the same time. And it's because of automatic processes. It's because of very simple, very mechanistic processes that we can launch and get started, and they'll kind of run on, and our bodies will do them more or less by themselves. And then our brain can go off and do another thing. But that's only true in a couple of ways. We appear to be able to do it. But when we're looking at that, we cannot do two things at the same time. We can't have two mental processes running at the same time. And we're not really very good at task switching, and that's what computers do. But when we try to multitask, what we wind up doing is the same thing that computers do very well, which is fast task switching, but we do it very poorly. Our brains were not built for that. For lots of neurobiological kinds of reasons, I won't get into it here. We're not effective at rapid task switching, but we're trying to do it over and over. And there are these glimmers of things, walking and chewing gum, and oh, I can cook bread and watch the kid at the same time. And so we get these glimmers that we might could do it. And it builds up into this mental image and mental habits of how it should work. And so we get into kind of hyper reactivity to our environment. And we think we can do this. We build up this idea in our heads, both an expectation of ourselves and an encouragement or an expectation of other people that we should be doing it. And then we wind up hopping back and forth, spinning plates and dropping things and making mistakes all the time when we're trying to multitask, but we can't. All we're doing is we're task switching, and we're trying to do it too quickly, and so the system is breaking down. Now, I refer to this a lot, and a lot of the time we wind up trying to task switch quickly because we've gotten another input or another stimulus. So we're doing thing A, and we get an email or a phone call, or somebody comes in and asks us to do thing B or asks us about thing B. And a lot of times that's why we start task switching, because we perceive that B has more urgency than A currently does. So we stop doing A and we start doing B, but we don't end A very well. So we get into this switching activity, and then it just grows into this mental habit, and we build tools that try to support us doing it. We use computers as ways to create interruptions, and we use our mobile phones to interrupt us all the time. And we do things before we forget it, which causes multitasking. And we really do all of these things, have all these habits that prevent us from behaving the way humans were built to behave, and that is monotasking. And that's just the state of the human brain, the productive state of the brain, particularly when we're doing heavy-duty mental lifting. So if we're rapid task switching, and I say we're hyperreactive to stimuli that call for us, things that stimulate our attention, and we don't learn to focus. So that's what I say. So right here, whoever's having this debate with me says, great, Larry, I'm hyperreactive. I've always heard that that's good customer service. That's speed, that's responsiveness, that's being good at what we do. It's being responsive to others' needs. That's what appears to be required in my life, is to be hyper responsive, to have fear of missing out, to be on text having 6 different conversations at the same time, keep up with social media, to respond within seconds anytime the phone rings. And so fine, guilty as charged. I've got no choice here. And that's what's necessary in my life. And I can hear some of you saying this right now. And that's really where I'm going to push back. As it turns out, it's not necessary. We just imagine that it is. We've been marketed that it is. And we've subtly been manipulated into acting as if it were true. Now, there are some jobs and some situations where you have to be hyper responsive, where that's your job. If you're an emergency room doctor, then that's your thing, and you've got to be hyper reactive and hyper responsive. But that's not all of us. And I think most of us would do much better to slow down and be more thoughtful. But we think priority. Our brain thinks in urgent terms, and we think, okay, urgency has a lot to do with emergencies. We think priority has a lot to do with urgency. And Stephen Covey talked about this. And this is the difference between urgent and important. And now he wrote his book 40 years ago, and we've been fighting this battle for that long or longer. This whole urgent versus important thing. We fight it and we fight it. And here we are getting close to being able to resolve it. And by resolve it, I mean understand that we've got the tools at our disposal to help us deal with this urgent versus important conundrum. So we want to create a life that has fewer urgent things in it. But you can't completely control it because you have other people in your life who are going to keep giving you urgent. And that's the way life is. That's fine. But we want to minimize that as much as we can. So I say that we're just building up this mental habit of hyper responsiveness. We're in the echo chamber where it seems like a good thing. We're trying to do it. We talk to other people. They seem to be trying to do it. It seems like that's what's encouraged for us from the TV and from the role models that we see. Elon Musk is out there talking about how he works 90 and 100 hours a week. But that I don't think that's actually what's required. And I'll say that the majority of people don't know about multitasking. They don't know that we can't do it. The majority of people don't know. The GBH article I mentioned earlier quoted Kamala Harris as saying, well, this administration is just going to have to multitask. She was asked how they're going to make all these policy changes they want to make. This goes back to the previous election cycle. Well, teams can multitask because they're made up of individuals who can monotask, and the individual can go off and do different things together at the same time. And that's why we have teams. But individual humans can't do that, cannot multitask. Still, we hear about it all the time. It's shown to us in heroic terms. And so we've just got this mental image that we should be able to do it. And the flip side of that is if we can't do it, then we feel weak and we're irritated and we're mad at ourselves and we're shamed, so we don't address the problems that not being able to do it causes. Now, I'm going to argue in our podcast here that task switching has an enormous cost. And it's not just a productivity cost. Lack of attention, task switching, presents its bill in a lot of different ways. And one of them is, yes, we do tasks poorly when we're trying to fast task switch. But there's nothing like multitasking to make you forget something. Forget if you did it, forget how you did it, because your attention is just not there. Task switching, things fall through the cracks because we don't pay attention to them. And that's just the way we're built as humans and the way things work for us. Another example, there's nothing like a little time stress, which is caused by the urgency of multiple tasks that are underway. Nothing like time stress to make us mean-spirited and rude to each other. So I'm going to argue that the opposite of reactivity is what's required for the modern worker. And the opposite of reactivity being thoughtfulness, being considering our actions, taking time to think about not only what tasks we're going to do, but also taking time to give deep attention to solving problems in our world and deep attention to solving problems in the broader world. What's required of the modern worker is to ask ourselves questions like, how can we do this better? One of the problems that we face in the modern work world, our machines are much more responsive than we are. They're much more consistent than we are, and they're much, much better trained than we are. They have more information, I'm going to say at their fingertips, than we do as human beings. They're much better at these things. You get on the phone or chat for a customer service problem, and the percentage of customer service problems that can be solved by our machines is large as an overall set of the problems, and it's increasing all the time. You want to get online and pay a bill, you don't even have to talk to a person. You certainly don't have to go anywhere, and you don't have to know how to use a computer. You get on the phone and you make a payment, and the system talks to me. I did that earlier today. I had to go pay a bill in a system I wasn't familiar with, so I dialed up the number, and the equipment talked me through it. And it said, say your number. And I said, my number. And it said, okay. And I got it right. And all these things. And it was asking me for account number information, what my balance was, all this different kind of stuff. And I was reading to it, talking to it, and poking the buttons. And the machine heard me and understood me and solved the problem. And that's the bulk of customer service is, hey, I need to do something. Can you help me? And the simple stuff happens much more often than the complicated stuff. So the computer's good at it. So we need to let it be good at it. And then we need to go and do what we're good at. And that's this inventive thing, this problem solving thing that we're very good at as humans, this imagination thing. Because in order to solve a problem, you have to imagine different possible solutions and select one that seems to have a good chance of working. And so that's a very human thing to be able to do. And we've got to go be doing those things rather than running a race with a machine that's going to beat us every time. So a lot of the time, our reactivity is based on this notion of customer service. Oh, I got to be available for my customers. Well, that's absolutely true. The question is, how available? And how are you best serving your customers with your availability? Are you best serving them by paying partial attention to what they need and to what they're telling you when they call you? Or are you best serving them by trying to give them attention, to have a relationship with them and trying to think through and provide them better service all the time? So we humans need to be spending our time finding and solving problems in our processes. There are systemic problems in the processes that we use to deliver for each other. If we're talking about customer service, well, rather than dealing with an angry customer, we should be using our attention to stop creating angry customers. And that's a very human thing, a problem-solving situation that requires deep analysis and thought versus getting on a phone call with an irate customer and fixing one-off problems in arrears, so to speak. We're solving the problem after it's already happened. Well, humans should be out in front. We need to be getting out in front and solving the problems before they happen. And that's much less reactive when we do that. Think about it. How long would it take you to figure out how to not have angry customers? Because that's a problem. You've got to sit there and think about that one. In your personal life, rather than think, oh, I've got to make time to stop and buy flowers for my wife to apologize for missing date night. Sure would be nice if we had the time to think about our process and figure out a way to stop missing date night. And then we won't have to stop and solve the other problem. If we can solve the first problem, then we don't have to solve the second problem all the time. And these are things that can only be done through thoughtful human work, at least at present. And even the things that humans are very good at, we can't develop or repair relationships in a hurry. We're very good at relationships, but we can't do it quickly. We can't do it efficiently. We're very good at learning, but we can't learn meaningful skills by cramming. Or to learn new skills, we need to practice. And our practice needs to have our focused attention, or else it's just a thrashing waste of time. Our relationships need our focused attention. It's the whole point of what we mean when we say relationship. People get unhappy when we're in relationship with them and they don't feel like they're getting our attention. Now, we can be apologetic about it, but we don't give our attention, and so our relationships are fractured and broken. And in part, it's those fractured relationships that cause some of these urgent, I'll say, quadrant one problems. I've seen it over and over again. I talk to people who have problems with managing their stuff. And one of the common stories, one of my buddies is an example of this. He runs his own company and he's very successful. But quite frankly, he's got relationship problems at home. And they're not getting better. That relationship is getting more and more demanding in terms of his time. And it's demanding his time at times that are inconvenient for him. And so he's constantly fighting these fires. But he's spending so much time fighting fires that he's not spending any time preventing. And that's really, that's this quadrant one versus quadrant two thing that Covey taught us. It's not new information. It's 40-year-old information. Quadrant one is urgent and important. Quadrant two is important, but not urgent. And the magic sauce is that if we don't take care of quadrant two items when we have the opportunity, they spin off, they create quadrant one items. To say it another way, many of our quadrant two tasks are to prevent quadrant one items from becoming quadrant one items. We talked about it before. A quadrant two task is to set up our processes so we don't create angry customers. A quadrant one task is deal with angry customers. So if we don't take on the quadrant two task, then we wind up taking on instances of the quadrant one task. An angry customer has to be dealt with right now. But if we don't have angry customers, then angry customers don't need to be dealt with right now. If we'll take the time to do it, we can create systems where our customers don't get angry with us as often. We can fix our product. We can have better quality. We have better relationships with our customers. We can give better service. But all that takes time to think through, and it can't be done in any sort of a particular hurry. Then we get into quadrant two, where we're doing important but not urgent work. And that's where we're fixing the stuff. That's where we're finding the problem and solving it. And that's one of the bad things that happens to us when we're in a hurry. We use Band-Aids and we don't solve problems. When we're in a hurry, we just try to get by. What's going to stop the bleeding? What can I do quickly? Not what's going to fix the problem. And we do this because we're in a hurry and I've got to move on to the next thing. I've got no time to sit here and think about this. Well, again, most of us are not emergency room surgeons in trauma. Yes, if somebody's bleeding, you need to solve that and get on to the next person who might be bleeding. But most of us, again, don't work in that environment. But even when we talk about that environment, and surgeons don't face this problem, emergency room docs do not face and address this problem. But wouldn't it be better if we stopped people from getting hurt rather than spending all our time patching them up after they've been hurt? And that's the situation that we're facing in our ability to get out in front of these things. And the frantic task switching, the multitasking, the hustle culture, quite frankly, seems to be resisting us doing that. The culture seems to be resisting our efforts to try to get thoughtful work in our lives. Now, it's a lot of different bits and pieces, but the notion of multitasking is one of them. I've mentioned Stephen Pressfield before and his idea of the resistance, which is really interesting. His resistance is a personified force that interferes with us doing our best work. Now, those of you know me know I'm a Christian, and I don't need to go very far to personify a force of evil in the world. It's part of my worldview. I don't want to be over dramatic here. But it is very much like there's a system or a group of forces or something that's pushing us in directions that are not good for us. And our current cultural moment, if you will, of thinly slicing our attention is really damaging us, in my opinion. Individually, it's making us less productive rather than more productive. It's pushing us towards and focusing us on the wrong kinds of tasks. It's not allowing us time to give thoughtful work, quality work that delights customers, rather than spending all our time doing work that just produces irritations for us. It's really interesting. We all know that bad work creates more work, but usually the more work that pops up is more urgent than the first. So it's not just that bad work creates more work, it's actually twice that bad. Bad work creates extra work that's more urgent. And so we're chasing down the spiral. People say, again, my debate partner here says, well, okay, that's the culture. I see everybody else doing it. My boss is very demanding. Well, is that actually true? Or is it just something that you believe? Have you looked into it and studied it? You know, if your customers are calling and you think you have to answer the phone 24 hours a day, maybe you should ask your customers a question. Call them up, say, I got your phone call. Would you have been willing to leave me a voicemail? If not, how would you like to communicate with me so that when I get your message, I can give you the attention you deserve? So begin to think about and understand and solve these problems rather than just automatically assuming that we have to be hyper reactive all the time. We say things like that. We say, I don't have any choice. I have to be hyper reactive. Well, let's just think about how that's working out for us. Do you have high stress? Is your job something that's sucking up too much of your attention, such that the other areas of your life that need attention are suffering? Are you content with that? Or are you just justifying and forgetting it? Have you learned to ignore the sacrifices that you're making? Have you just adapted to the pain? I think we should be thinking about that. I want the podcast to be fun to listen to and lighthearted, but it also needs to be instructive. And if we go around like the work culture in the world wants us to, then we're spending all our time watching television and buying chips so that we're too tired to get up and do anything other than watch television and eat chips. Have we adapted to the lack of peace and calm in our lives and in our world? Have we just given up on that? Have we lost a vision of what that could be in our lives? Have we all turned into adrenaline junkies? Or do we know how to motivate ourselves to do work at the time that work needs to be done so that we're not relying on adrenaline? Are you deadline driven? That's a challenge because we don't like being deadline driven. And we think maybe we shouldn't be deadline driven and that it's a bad thing. But then that's all the world teaches us is how to be deadline driven, how to pay attention to the next alarm and the next flashing light. and how to have our attention, quite frankly, robbed from us. And it's death by 1,000 cuts. Have we adapted to that lack of peace and calm? Have we just gotten numb to it? Have we gotten numb to the lack of deep relationships in our lives? Gotten numb to the fact that our relationships are cursory, and maybe even our closest relationships are not deep, thoughtful, attentive. They don't have our full attention. Have we just adapted to that? As partners in a relationship, we can have these silent agreements, which maybe is not good. The silent agreement is I'll ignore you if you'll ignore me. I'm not trying to judge anybody. But is there some part of you that wants a little bit better, that wants a little bit more than that? Another example, have you just adapted to the lack of sleep and good rest? Here's one I'm still working on. I enjoy caffeine and I use it. So I spend time thinking about whether I need to adjust my life so that I'm sleeping better and thus have more consistent energy throughout the day. Is that work that needs to be happening in my life, or have I just adapted to that situation and learned to ignore the pain of it? Another scenario, a lot of people in the world are looking for meaning. And that appears to be a tough thing, to find meaning in the work that we do. We do know that humans do, in fact, find great value in work, in producing results in the world. And I'm not necessarily talking about just your job results. I'm talking about results generally. And we get fulfilled in some ways by our ability to work with the materials that we're confronted with in the world. Now, that's a maker culture. It's a creator culture, and we're very adaptable critters. So if we can't be makers, we can get along and we can adapt in ways that we've talked about before. But maybe there's still a lack of meaning there. And a lot of people have addressed this. There's a whole school of people who think that we all ought to have some manual physical task in our lives just to feed that urge to create. That, if you can't do anything else with the things of the world, then get a knife and learn to whittle, right? Just to interact with the physical things and the creation. And their thinking is that we're driven, we're built, we're created to expect results in real life, in the actual world. And that so much of our stuff is computer mediated and happens with other people that we don't have that sense of making anymore. And we don't have that sense of, yeah, I carved that piece of wood. Pretty, isn't it? That sense of, that's me playing the bass line there. What do you think? That sense of having a tangible effect on the world, an observable thing that's not us. And if we don't have that, then according to this school of thought, that's a source of lack of meaning. I think a lot of people face that, particularly in their work. But then the way we approach work pulls us away from the non-work things in similar ways. And thus, we experience very little meaning in anything that we do. We're too stressed and tired to have a hobby because we're so busy keeping up with the challenges of our franticness to do our work. And we say, oh, that's because my job is hard, or my boss is demanding, or I'm a perfectionist. And we make up lots of reasons why we approach it this way. But maybe the real reason is we're afraid to do anything else. I think it's a mental habit and we're afraid to break it. So I'm using this podcast to think about that and to help you think about it for yourself. So we're reactive. Is that a good thing? I don't think so. I think it's a good thing to stop and think about your stuff. What if your reactivity is just a habit that maybe is adopted from a distorted picture of what everybody else is doing? We know that on social media, this notion that everybody is posting the highlights of their life makes us believe things about them that simply aren't true. And thus we get dissatisfied with our own situation because we think theirs is perfect. Well, comparison has always been a problem. I think it's in the Bible. It says comparison is the thief of joy, and it's certainly the thief of contentment. So are we looking at people's social media and them saying I'm a multitasker, but they're not? Like we look at people's social media and they say I'm rich because I went to Paris, but they're still in debt. They say I'm a multitasker and they don't know that they're not. So I ran across a really interesting idea also in the WGBH article. It turns out, and this is an idea that I'm familiar with from other places, it's the people that are really bad at multitasking that think they're good at it. And I can give you the citation if you're interested. Just reach out and connect with me, hit me, email, LinkedIn, whatever. And I'm happy to talk about some of this sort of stuff. But if you're interested, there's a whole class of tasks that we're not good at knowing how good we are at them. And in this case, we typically think we're better than we are at them. You've heard it perhaps said that 3/4 of statistics professors think they're better than average teachers. And this is one of those examples, right? And it's a little tongue in cheek, but we think we're pretty good at stuff when in fact we're terrible at it, but we can't see it. So we do what we think everybody else is doing, but we don't see in their lives. We don't see how frantic and ill-tempered they are in most cases. Well, I'm just busy, they say. Okay, fine. In some cases, we're just too busy being jerks to each other. But if we're looking at this distorted picture of the world in which multitasking is a thing that we should be doing, then that leads to a misunderstanding of what it takes to create meaning and value and peace in the world. For me, the principle of doing that is focused attention. First and foremost, yes, you got to have skills, but even the skills themselves, focused attention is the way you get new skills. The point of all this is that we can't multitask. We don't multitask. Our brains are not capable of it, but we continue to try. And we do that because of environmental factors. But many of those environmental factors can be fixed. And that's what I teach in the podcast and in the attention compass process. So people who work with me often say things like, well, I never considered that. Or, well, when you put it that way, it makes total sense. And maybe you've had a similar experience. And that's what I'm trying to bring through this podcast is some different thinking into the world. The notion of multitasking. Well, if it's not something we can do, then why do we do it? What's causing distraction? Which causes multitasking. What's causing distraction is the number of things you're trying to keep in your head. I say that, people say, well, that makes perfect sense. The next question is, what do I do about it? And so I help people begin to fix that once they've come to this awareness. For many of us, in some ways, we're too close to our own situation, and that makes it hard to see the bigger picture. The metaphors are readily available. Can't see the forest for the trees. The shoemaker's children have bad shoes because the shoemaker is too busy making and selling shoes to fix shoes for his own kids. Well, we're too busy thrashing and running around to stop and get better at not thrashing. And so it's cyclical and it feeds on itself. So the goal is to find ways to step away and make our mental habits less frazzled and stressful. And that's what I'm all about in doing Busy Right. Of course, you don't know what you don't know. And that makes it impossible to find a solution to your problem. So you go and gather knowledge, and then you are presented with a solution, or you figure out a solution. That's fine. So how are you going about finding the knowledge? And I hope that's here on the podcast with me. So that sort of brings us full circle. I think, to use an aging term, I think we're just psyched out. I think we're psyched out by the environment that we face and by other people claiming to be able to do something. I think we're psyched out by media who tells us it's the hustlers who get the brass ring. Well, maybe, but what do they give up? If all you want out of life is money, there's plenty of things you can do to make a whole bunch of money. Many of them have questionable legality. In other areas, you can simply destroy the people in your life in your search for money success. Or can you do relaxed and calm productivity? Just get better at what you do. At the end of the day, I think it's just a question of patience. Can we be patient? Or are we all too busy shouting at each other to go faster to be patient? So let's take a quick recap of where we are. We started talking about the fact that we don't multitask. We can't multitask. The term multitasking did not originate in any sort of psychology or in any sort of human behavior study. In fact, prior to the second half of the 20th century, nobody even talked about multitasking in human performance. Everything was focus on what you're doing, be careful, pay attention. The productivity management philosophy and the successful life philosophy was all wrapped up in that. But now we're in the situation where our tools are faster than we are. It goes all the way back to the 20s or 30s with Charlie Chaplin and Modern Times. Modern Times is the name of the movie where he's stuck in the machine and he can't keep up. He has to keep running around and dodging things. Now, the other image is Lucille Ball in the 50s eating chocolates because she's on the assembly line and she couldn't keep up with wrapping them and getting them in the boxes. And we all do this. We've all been doing it for 70 years. And I would suggest that it's getting worse and worse and worse. But I also suggest that we can step off the merry-go-round. The first thing we got to do is we got to stop thinking in terms of multitasking. We got to stop thinking in terms of this hyper reactivity because we simply can't do it that way. We have to step back and think about a better way to create value because our machines are catching up with us on the reactive front. The machines are more reactive than we are. So we're thinking about this and we go, finally, okay, well, multitasking is not a thing. It's not good for me. So what do we do? So I would suggest if multitasking is not a thing, then what I need to do is to be better and not just faster. I need to be more thoughtful and produce better solutions rather than just faster solutions. And I know this is counter to a lot of what's commonly heard out there. And you know the productivity press, you read it just like I have. Well, I got to do more and more and more. Got to pack more into the day. How can I do more tasks in the day? But what we need to do, we need to do better. And a lot of times, more, faster are the enemy of better. So walking back through it, we think we can multitask. Other people think they can multitask, and we're all collectively wrong. But the misconception leads to this collective blindness and a collective notion that our work should be frantic, which bleeds over into our lives should be frantic, which bleeds over into us creating a huge number of tasks that are expensive and time-consuming in the name of pleasure and enjoyment. Because we suffer so much at work, we need to go recharge our batteries. So we're frantic on both ends of the spectrum, both sides of the scale. Well, maybe we could learn to recharge our batteries in real time. Maybe we could learn to do our jobs in such a way that they don't deplete our batteries. Now, I've tried to approach this from a lot of different ways, but that's really the goal of what we're talking about in this podcast. So the takeaway here is just recognize that this is another piece of evidence that we can't multitask, this story about the history of multitasking. And we trip up. We can't multitask, but we trip up. Society and our devices and our processes push us into situations where we think we have to multitask, and we're bad at it. And unless we do something about it, it's going to continue. And if anything, it's going to get. We're rapid task switching. And we do it, I guess, because we think it's the right thing to do, the only thing to do. But we're beginning to realize that not only is it the wrong thing to do, but it's a harmful thing. So here we are We're trying to dig our way out. And that's something you can learn here on the podcast. Listen, everything you need to learn about my tool for getting inside of this problem, everything you need to learn about attention compass, you can learn here on the podcast. You don't have to pay me a nickel. I'd love for you to get a hold of what's here and go and implement. And I think everything you need is somewhere in the podcast. Now, if that's not the way you roll, I'm happy to help you learn. In fact, I will mention that I've got a new group starting up. If you're listening to this podcast in real time, the group starts at the first full week of 2025. And so if you'd like to reach out to me and consider what's involved in getting into that group, I'd love to talk with you about it. As always, you can reach me on LinkedIn or through direct email. My email is larry@dobusywrite.com. I'd love to hear from you on your challenges and what you're facing in this area of productivity. So let's get out there and monotask, and tell your friends, I'm monotasking, leave me alone. Monotasking, and get a shirt. I'm going to start putting it on my resume. I'm a great monotasker. And then we'll see if we can't get up on top of our lives. I'll leave it there for now. This is Larry Tribble, Ph.D. Thanks for taking some time to improve your task and information management on the Do Busy Right podcast. The show is dedicated to helping you think about how to get better at working. And we do this by improving your attention and your focus. I believe that your work is not just about your job, but about all the tasks that you do to turn yourself, your environment, and your relationships into what you want them to be. What we're really talking about here is the underpinnings of becoming who you want to be. The primary way I help people is through coaching the attention compass process. Attention compass is 4 workflows and a tool set that support our information, task, and attention management. I help people with big goals to build habits that put them in a position to achieve. We do this by eliminating wasted time and wasted attention. If you'd like to know more, you can find me on LinkedIn or go to dobusywrite.com for more information. Have a good week, more effective and less exhausted. Do Busy Right.